Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to start part two of the struggle of equality, talking about struggle for equality, I should say, talking about the civil rights movement in general. We had left off discussing the Little Rock Nine. We have so far we've got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The African Americans in the South, because of the Plessy versus Ferguson case, were having to live under Jim Crow segregation. But in the 50s, we see that the Brown versus Board of Education case reversed separate but equal, and so technically we shouldn't be segregating schools anymore in the anywhere in the country, but most particularly in the South. The you know the segregation in the South was still going on, because in the Brown case we see that the Supreme Court left in a phrase called "with all deliberate speed," and so there are lots of Southern governors that are pushing that off. The Little Rock Nine challenged that, and so we're starting to see the school system open up, and the Montgomery bus boycotts, right? So the buses in Montgomery were segregated buses. The Rosa Parks challenges that law. It gets challenged both economically through a boycott that's really going to break the backs of these buses. They'll desegregate on their own, but then you'll also see that the Supreme Court will rule that Brown holds to these buses as well. And so we're starting to see some momentum. And one of the groups that really comes out of the Montgomery bus boycott that's going to be a super influential group in the civil rights movement is going to be the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Remember, during the Montgomery bus boycott, it's Martin Luther King Jr. who really becomes like the standout figure and the de facto leader of the civil rights movement. I say that leader because there's no real one leader, and Martin Luther King's approach isn't the only approach. And we'll talk about other leaders in the movement in future lectures. But the SCLC is essentially Martin Luther King's group. It's one of the first civil rights organizations in the South. Comes about during the Montgomery bus boycott. A lot of the Southern African American church leadership gets caught up in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in that group. It is a nonviolent group. They recognize that if they want to get change in America, they've got to do it through the democratic process, and the only way you can do that is you got to get the majority of Americans involved, and that means you have to have white support. And they recognize that if that what they're trying to do is going to cause violence, right? But it can't be on their end. Their movement has to be nonviolent because they have to get sympathy from the average voter, and that means the white guy in Ohio has to side with the black guy in Alabama. And the movement recognizes is that if the movement turns violent, that white guy in Ohio just won't end up supporting them, and we won't get real change. And the goal is like real federal legislation that desegregates the South in all aspects, because this court battle stuff is just taking too long. One court battle at a time to desegregate a bus, then a school, then a lunch counter, right? I mean, if you do that for every aspect of society, that'll just take forever. And so the movement is nonviolent. It knows it will be confronted with violence, and it wants to use that to its advantage. And so, if you're nonviolent, but the other side is violent, if you can get that on film or in a picture, that will create sympathy. And remember, that average white guy in Ohio, he'll become more and more sympathetic to your cause. And so, very PR savvy group of people. The entire civil rights movement just has a lot of public relations savvy. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, their real big focus is going to be on boycotts. It's going to be on helping support the legal movement through the NAACP. And, that's really kind of a slow process. And so a lot of members of the of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the younger members start to get frustrated. And boycotts are incredibly slow, right? And so the younger members of the movement will eventually split from the SCLC and form their own their own group called SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. From this point forward, I'll call it SNCC. It's just easier. And these are typically younger, a little bit more radical. They're still nonviolent, and that's important here. But they don't want to just go out and boycott and protest, right? They are more inclined for direct action. And direct action means that it's the civil disobedience part of nonviolent civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is, Henry David Thoreau really kind of popularized the term. He writes a book called Civil Disobedience and kind of lays the groundwork for this logic, which is if there's an unjust law in the books, and not just a law that you disagree with, right? Like I disagree that the speed limit should be 55. Like I think it should be 65, but follow that law and whether I like it or not. But an unjust law, Thoreau said, you have an obligation to break that law to, and in a nonviolent way, right? Not in a violent way, but you have an obligation to break that law to draw attention to it being unjust so democracy can go to work to fix that law. And so the civil rights movement, the SCLC and SNCC for sure, believes in civil disobedience. So, segregation, that's clearly an unjust law. And so they're going to go out and break that law in a nonviolent manner, which means they're not going to resist arrest. They're not going to cuss. They're not going to spit. They're not going to be violent, even when they are being beaten up by, the local white population or the police, right? And they're breaking that law to draw attention to how unjust it is. And so SNCC is really going to be about the direct action part, the civil disobedience part of that. They tend to be younger. And again, right, younger people are going to be more inclined to be willing to do this for a number of reasons. One, young people tend to be a little bit more rash and so more inclined to break a law like that. The other thing is they've got less to lose. If you're 55 and African American in the South in the 1950s, the wealth has been on the rise in the 1950s. The sharecropping system has ended because of World War I and World War II. And so if you broke into the middle class as an African American and you've got a house and a job, are you going to really be willing to go out and sit in a segregated lunch counter and get arrested and then potentially lose your job and everything you built up? Probably not. And so, and rightfully so, everybody's got to make that decision for themselves. But young people, they don't have the house yet. They don't have the wealth saved up. They don't have the good job yet. And so they're a little bit more inclined to accept the risk that is naturally associated with civil disobedience. And so SNCC becomes, is going to be a major player. As a matter of fact, they're going to be one of the big five civil rights groups, the NAACP, the National Urban League, which is going to focus on helping Black people in major cities, SNCC, SCLC, the two that we just talked about today, and then CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So SNCC is taking on a larger and larger role in society, and they really begin with student sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. Most restaurants in the South are segregated. White people can sit at the lunch counter. You can get faster, better service there, and Blacks aren't allowed to sit there. And so SNCC is really going to be upset with these segregated lunch counters. And so they're going to start these protests to try and desegregate lunch counters. And we'll talk about, we'll talk about Greensboro, North Carolina here in just a second. They're also going to support the Freedom Rides. We'll do a lecture on the Freedom Rides as well, and the March on Washington. So they're involved in the March on Washington, which is going to take 250,000 people to Washington to try and get through national civil rights legislation that'll end segregation across the board. It's been stalled in Congress, and all the major groups are going to converge onto Washington. It's where Martin Luther King gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. That is just, he talks about imagining a post-racial world where we don't judge each other on our skin, but rather on the content of our character. right? This idea that we should eventually evolve beyond race and judge people based on who they are and not what they look like. And so that's Martin Luther King's philosophy and the philosophy of most African Americans in the civil rights movement. So SNCC is going to be organizing these lunch counter sit-ins, and so one of the first major sit-ins is going to be in Greensboro, North Carolina, at the Woolworths lunch counter. This is a planned event. SNCC knows that the lunch counters are segregated, and they're going to organize this nonviolent protest. They're going to sit down at the lunch counter. They're going to just ask for a meal. They know that they're going to be denied this meal, and they know once that they're denied this meal that eventually the local community will come out to protest their protest. And the SNCC really is, as a PR organization, is very savvy, and so they call the media ahead of time and they say, "Hey, we're going to have this sit-in," because they want the crowd to show up. And so they organize the sit-in. The media shows up. It causes a big ruckus. The white community that is opposed to desegregation is going to show up to try and stop this. SNCC has organized shifts of kids to come in that as they get arrested, because the police are going to get called, they're going to arrest a new kid is going to come sit at the lunch counter. And having the media there allows them to be able to take images like this. Again, we're trying to create sympathy so that average dude in Ohio or Wisconsin, has sympathy and will vote for or tell their congressman to vote for legislation to end this kind of segregation. And so SNCC plays this really well and starts to, call out the community, and you see scenes like this image. I want you to notice a couple things. One, the protesters are sitting there. Again, the women have dresses on. The gentleman has a tie. They're not reacting as they're being called names. They're being spit on. They're having food dumped on their, pushed in their faces, drinks dumped on their head. They're being treated absolutely terribly. Eventually, the police are going to show up and have them arrested. They're not going to resist arrest or be disrespectful at any point at time here. And then look at the group of the kids, the white kids that are, essentially attacking these protesters. Which group do you have sympathy for? Right? I mean, when you see this image, whether you're white or black, you're just you can imagine your own kid, who's idealistic and wants to right all the wrongs in the world, goes off to college and takes a stand on a moral issue and then gets treated this way. Right? I mean, this is a thing that the average American can relate to, and like, you shouldn't treat another human being, terribly like this. And so it will help create sympathy to desegregate these lunch counters. The other thing I want you to notice too is that the protesters that are protesting segregation, they're biracial, they're white and they're black. The civil rights movement isn't just African Americans. It is also, significantly part of the white population. And so, this is a biracial protest, which again helps create more sympathy. Like later, the freedom rides are going to be the same thing. And, they're primarily younger white kids, again, kind of for the same reason that it's, these direct action things tend to be younger. And so we'll see here that these protests will spread to 55 cities in 13 states. And it will slowly start to desegregate these lunch counters. Right? These businesses, they don't like this. They want this to go away. Right? They're not making money in a situation like this. And so slowly we'll start to see progress in the desegregation of these lunch counters. The last thing I want to talk about in this lecture today is another one of the big five groups, civil rights groups, and that's the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. This group's a little bit different. The SCLC and SNCC are both Southern civil rights groups, which means they're tough. To be a Southern civil rights worker, it means that you are confronted with violence on a daily basis. Civil rights workers in the South, black and white, are disappearing. They're being, taken out in the woods and killed. They're, during the Montgomery bus boycotts, we know houses were lit on fire, churches were bombed. I mean, it's absolutely the intimidation there is exceptional. CORE going to be, I mean, I don't want to say it's a softer group, but it's a little bit more risk averse because they're a northern group and they're not as exposed to the violence of the South. Now, there's racism in the North. I mean, 1919 Chicago race riots, an example of that. I mean, there's definitely racism in the North, but it is not nearly as violent as in the South. People are still being lynched in the South, and so this group, it's a northern group that will eventually head down south. The CORE is going to be the one that starts the Freedom Rides, which is an attempt to desegregate the interstate buses, interstate bus system. And they're going to quit the Freedom Rides. They're going to quit the Freedom Rides because it gets too violent, and it's going to be SNCC that really will take over the Freedom Rides because again, they're just more used to violence, and they're more willing to put their lives on the line rather than CORE. CORE is going to be involved with SNCC in the Woolworth sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, and so it's not just SNCC. CORE also very prevalent on college campuses. Eventually they're going to move down into the South with the Freedom Rides, although that won't be very successful. What they will be able to do in the South is they will help with voter registration. They're going to face all kinds of adversity while they're down there, and these kids are brave kids too. It's just they're not as hard as a lot of the Southern groups. Like I said, as far as CORE is concerned, one of their big contributions in the South is heading down south to help register voters. They're going to do that semi-successfully, but that's a very dangerous thing to do down in the South. All right, that's where we're going to leave off today with the second part of struggling for equality. We will pick up in our next lecture with the Freedom Rides and some more victories that we're going to experience in the Deep South. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Have a good day, and I will see you soon.